Now, our next speaker is Jason Matheny, and Jason is the Deputy Director for National Security at the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. Jason wanted to join us live for this session, but unfortunately, or rather maybe fortunately for him, he has to be now at a NASA launch, so he couldn't join us. I had the chance to talk with Jason in his White House office a few days ago, and we recorded this keynote. And afterwards, we had a short conversation that we recorded as well.
Thanks, Nabil. It's a real pleasure to be here. The history of AI is one of international collaboration, and so is the future of AI. So I'm excited to see the breadth of international participation today at this conference. I'm going to speak for about 15 minutes or so about the applications of AI that I'm especially excited about, some of our technical challenges, some categories of international policy, and then a few priorities for international cooperation. And then I look forward to a lively discussion with you, Nabil, to cover our remaining time. So one of the things I was asked to talk about are the applications of AI that I'm most excited about. And I think among the most valuable, but probably least glamorous applications of AI are the back office process automation applications, such as finance, contracts, logistics, as that's where we as a society and most of our organizations spend so much time and money. And while we work out some unsolved problems in the security and safety of AI systems, that doesn't need to slow down the application of AI in the back office, where the safety and security issues are much lower risk. Some future applications that I think will be especially impactful include cybersecurity, where monitoring and analysis could be substantially helped by AI and where defense might actually gain the upper hand. And I'm excited about applications of AI to accelerate science and engineering. We see early examples in using AI to solve hard problems in biochemistry and drug screening that have for years defied sort of human solutions and now are finding solutions with the assistance of AI. And I think we'll see much more of this type of work in the years to come. For some applications of AI that are on the horizon, we will need to solve some intimidating technical challenges. And I'll discuss about 6 of those. The first is causality. Despite our impressive progress in identifying the associations within data, we haven't made nearly as much progress in understanding how events are caused. The most important events in the world are those that are consequential enough that we want to influence them in some way. We're good at determining when 2 events are correlated, but we rarely know how the world might be different if we take action A versus action B. A richer statistical understanding of causality is needed. And there are some interesting approaches being pursued in unsupervised learning of causal rules within AI research. A second major technical challenge is explainability. And this is a particular challenge for machine learning. Can a system explain to a human user why it generated the result that it did? This is really daunting with deep learning, where the methods are fairly opaque to human inspection. There are several efforts in machine learning that require that the systems explain the results in natural language, mainly for a cultural reason, which is that users are often unlikely to trust a system unless they understand how its results were generated. There's sometimes a performance hit in requiring explainability, but this hit is worth it when users wouldn't otherwise use the tools. A third challenge is rare and extreme events. Most AI systems were optimized for average results on average data. But for some critical applications, there's a special need to optimize at the extremes. And we don't yet know how to better train and test our systems on low frequency events that are especially consequential and represent safety risks, but for which our data sets are going to underrepresent those types of events. The OECD AI principles emphasize the importance of systems that are safe. And the US is also a contributor to the Global Partnership on AI that emphasizes AI safety. Collectively, in those organizations and in others, we need to work towards technical standards and methods of measurement to make AI systems that are verifiably safe. And I think one opportunity for international collaboration is a shared bed in which to test systems against known failure modes and using international competitions that reward the development of more robust systems. A fourth technical challenge is robustness to spoofing. Many of today's AI systems can be spoofed or fooled sort of through optical illusions, through fairly simple hacks. And it's become a favorite parlor trick in undergraduate computer science classes to show how an image recognition system can be fooled by misplacing pixels here and there in ways that are imperceptible to a human viewer, but cause a misclassification of an image or an audio cut or some other type of perceptual data. So a picture of you is now identified to be a picture of me, even though to a human observer, it's obviously a picture of you. These are sometimes called adversarial examples, and there's a lot of relatively innocent mischief that one could do with these sorts of techniques. But there are also some ways to do a lot of damage. And this is an important problem. And before we embed AI in especially high consequence systems, we should be more confident that our systems are robust to adversarial attacks. It's pretty humbling that these types of vulnerabilities were really only discovered within the last several years, even though the methods of neural nets were, especially deep neural nets, is over 35 years old at this point. That suggests that there are many more vulnerabilities to be discovered. It also suggests that we're likely to need a discipline of AI security that is as robust as the discipline of cybersecurity. The vast majority of work in AI really isn't built with adversaries in mind. So if you're using code that hasn't been red teamed, that hasn't had people try to break it, you should probably assume that it isn't secure against an adversary. And that might be fine, depending on the application, if it's code that won't ever face an adversary. But if your code will face someone who wants to break it, then consider getting a red team that's sincere and wanting to break your system and have them try to break it. This is what the cybersecurity community already does. They already have a sort of red team mentality in which it recognizes that there are people who want to break their systems and gum up the works. And we probably need to bring some of that same sensibility to machine learning research. A fifth technical challenge is privacy. And this is an important challenge, not only because of legal requirements for privacy protection, but also because a commitment to privacy is a comparative advantage for democratic nations. Our shared values around privacy can actually enable a higher level of cybersecurity for our systems. Advances in data science and AI have created challenges for privacy. For example, de-anonymization techniques, model inversion in AI, which can be used to reconstruct some training data from a trained model. But we also have some encouraging advances in privacy, such as differential privacy techniques, federated learning and other forms of distributed learning, and progress in homomorphic encryption. We need more of that, and we also need to ensure that international standards for AI, such as those being developed in ISO SC42, are compatible with privacy-preserving methods. I think that our progress in those 5 areas has been pretty limited over the last several years. We really need to double or quadruple down on our efforts in those areas as each represents a significant barrier to broader and more beneficial applications of AI. A sixth challenge I want to note is hype, is exaggeration of capability, and there's a lot of it in AI. My general position is to be fairly skeptical of marketing claims about AI, and to try to bring together technical experts who are really inclined to tell the truth, especially when it's going to be painful, when it's a truth I don't want to hear. So, every business, every sort of decision maker, I encourage to try to bring on people who are highly technical and also just extremely honest, even when it's painful. I also recommend using prize challenges or competitions as a way to test out a bunch of ideas before you buy them. I think they're among the most cost-effective tools in the tech world for sorting out reality from fantasy. So simply, test these systems before you commit to buying them. I want to close with a discussion of some of the international policy challenges that at least I'm trying to figure out how to follow. The first is how policy can be applied to the inputs to AI technologies. So talent, computing, algorithms, data, and money. And a second is how policy can be applied to the outputs of AI technologies. So applications and consequence management. And all I'll describe here is sort of a framework for categorizing these rather than providing much wisdom on how we use these tools, which I'm still trying to work out for myself. So some examples of policy applied to inputs include international policies that affect human talent, including immigration policies, global standards for accrediting education programs and certifying skills, and development of norms with professional societies such as IEEE. A second primary input is money, for which the United States uses CFIUS for governing investment, and other countries have their own systems for monitoring international investments in their own technology companies. A third input is computing. International policies that affect computing include trade policies that affect the sale of certain kinds of semiconductors or the equipment that's used to manufacture semiconductors. A fourth input is algorithms. And here, global governance includes things like cooperative research on safety and security, international standards for algorithmic robustness, transparency and security, international metrics for benchmarking, for evaluating performance, and standards for interoperability within international organizations, NATO being an example. A last input is data. So global governance could include creating multinational data sets and ISO standards for data formats. So those are examples of policies that affect inputs. International policy can also be applied to the outputs of AI technologies. Some examples there include potential international agreements about applications, such as limits on the applications of AI to certain classes of weapon systems. For example, deciding that we won't have anti-personnel autonomous weapons or commercial sales of autonomous weapons. We could have agreements about the distribution of AI technologies, such as limits on the export of certain classes of weapons or capabilities. Intellectual property agreements would be another example. And agreements to address the consequences of these applications, such as multilateral efforts to counter disinformation, surveillance, and censorship. Managing these tools for global governance of AI requires some capabilities. We need multilateral organizations to reach agreements. We need diplomatic organizations within national governments that are sufficiently tech savvy to negotiate those agreements. We need international technical institutions such as ISO and IEEE, where we can debate standards and pressure test them. And then we need testing and benchmarking labs, such as NIST in the United States, that can assess compliance to standards and compare performance. We also need non-governmental organizations and think tanks that support less formal international dialogues so that we can understand where the pain points are going to be before we bring them into formal discussions. Since it seems pretty cheap for me to simply list a bunch of things in a framework without prioritizing them, I'll highlight 3 forms of global governance whose importance I had underestimated and now believe are really central. The first is immigration policy associated with AI talent. Talent is, I think, by far the most important resource for any AI project. And talent is distributed globally. No country has a monopoly on AI talent. And for the most part, countries that are competing in AI are really competing over talent. Democratic countries have historically been more successful in attracting and retaining global talent, in part because scientists and engineers tend to be more cosmopolitan and want to live in freer societies. That has been a great advantage for democratic countries and their technology development. It is likely to be the case for AI talent as well. But in recent years, we have seen worrying trends and barriers that are preventing high-skilled immigration, and that if they persist, could severely handicap technological progress in our countries. A second important category of global governance is trade policy associated with semiconductors. And one interesting feature of the geography of semiconductors is that around 90% of the semiconductor manufacturing equipment in the world is sold by just 3 countries, the US, Japan, and the Netherlands. I think we should be especially thoughtful about how we share that equipment, as once that equipment is accessible to a country, it's very difficult to prevent that country from using it to make advanced weapon systems or large-scale surveillance systems. Semiconductor manufacturing equipment then represents one of our best opportunities to shape global norms in technology and prevent misuse. Third and last, international standards can have enormous inertia. We still have to retrofit at a cost of many billions of dollars a year the international standards that were set for the internet several decades ago. They're difficult to unwind once that they're set in. So we really need to put a lot of thought into standards. There's a problem known as the Collingridge dilemma, which says that when you try to exercise foresight to govern a technology before its applications are well understood, it's typically too early to know how to govern the technology. But by the time you know how to govern that technology, it's often too late to have much of an impact because the horse has already left the barn. So perhaps the most useful investment that we can make in international standards is to help to build the institutions and the decision-making process for establishing good AI standards, and using a process that is fair, that's not vulnerable to coercion or to voting blocks or tit versus tat sort of negotiations over what really should be driven by technical concerns. And that needs to be a multilateral effort. With that, I'll turn it back over to you, Nabil, and I really look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Jason. That was really a very comprehensive overview of AI and some of the challenges that lie ahead. So I wanted to ask you specifically about AI policy, and you're sitting also now in the White House, so I think this is the most appropriate setting for that. So, when we in Europe look at AI policy, we try usually to find the right balance between promoting AI on the one hand and limiting its perceived dangers. However, I feel that US policymakers usually view AI and technology in general through the prism of national security. You're also a member of the National Security Council. It's more like your geostrategic challenges, rivalry with China and so on. Would you agree with this assessment?
I probably wouldn't, just because so much of what we develop in AI really has nothing to do with national security. I mean, my guess is if you looked at the amount of money going into AI in the United States, that probably less than 10% of it has any connection to national security. I mean, overwhelmingly, the research is commercial, the applications are commercial. And so I think national security is actually a pretty small sliver of investment and sort of attention generally in AI. It's important, and I think we do need to get it right because it matters. But I don't think it dominates either the funding or the policy debates.
So if we look only at the policy side, would you say that the administration, for example, your administration is taking concrete measures to increase AI adoption among American businesses? Is it even a concern for you?
Yeah, it is. In fact, if I think for those who are sort of following U.S. policy right now, some of the most interesting things that are happening is, an unprecedented level of proposed investment in science and technology. Proposal to expand the National Science Foundation, to be an agency with a new technology directorate that would be funding AI and other critical areas of emerging technology. Again, not so much for national security applications, but for their applications that have a broad range of benefits across society. Increased investment in the National Institute for Standards and Technology, increased investments in other parts of the Department of Commerce to build infrastructure supporting technology development across the country, including in regions that have been sort of neglected for technology investment, as well as investments in telecommunications infrastructure that will support the application of AI. So I think this is really a phenomenally exciting time in U.S. domestic policy because of these proposed investments in infrastructure, science and technology, and education. So figuring out how we expand STEM education from K through gray, as we say. So being able to make those investments in ways that are going to benefit the entire workforce.
Mm-hmm. Can we expect any policy changes from the Biden administration regarding AI and technology in general? Compared, of course, with the Trump administration. So what are maybe the three main differences that you can identify?
So one is, I think, a strong emphasis on finding ways of accelerating the development of privacy-preserving machine learning, which really is an emphasis for the administration, is understanding what research investments do we need to make so that we can deploy things like federated learning, differential privacy, homomorphic encryption at scale, and protect data while it's being processed, while it's being stored, while it's being transmitted all the time. I think, and not require that AI systems that are especially high performing involve lots of centralized unencrypted data. I mean, it's not just a violation of privacy, it's also a violation of sort of security principles. So we should be developing machine learning systems that are able to operate on encrypted data and are also able to operate on distributed or decentralized data. That for us is a priority. Another priority for the administration is an emphasis on international standards as being a really important domain for engagement. And as I had mentioned, we see enormous inertia from technology standards that carry over many years after they're developed. We need to get this right, and we need to do so in partnership with other democratic countries that really are interested in getting the technical standards to be compatible with privacy. And with other democratic norms, preventing easy misuse for applications for wide-scale surveillance, for example. So those technical standards are really essential, and we need to work collectively to ensure that those technical standards are less vulnerable to coercion by China and by others that really have viewed this as an area in which you can use strong arm tactics and bring in voting blocks through, Belt and Road Initiative incentives. I think that's not the way that these standards bodies should be run. So we need to ensure, the integrity of the standards process is restored. A third differentiation, I think, is a really strong interest in making sure that we get the safety issues right in AI. And there are important safety problems with AI that we have not solved. And so before we place AI in especially consequential applications, we need to solve those safety issues. And that will probably be an international research effort that we work on with other countries that have shared concerns about the application of AI. We also need to have frank discussions with our competitors about the potential misuse of AI or the escalation risks of AI, whether it's in weapon systems, whether it's in cyber systems. We need to make sure that we understand what the rules of engagement for these new tools are, so that we don't cause some strategic miscalculation on either side. So that's an important area where we need to find ways of ensuring that AI systems don't complicate the problems that we already have and misinterpreting signals from one side or the other, leading to some sort of escalatory dynamic. I think lots of progress is possible on this, just from the example of other, strategic arms talks in which we've understood, like, what are the red lines, what are the guardrails. This sort of level of discussion, though, hasn't been as fulsome around AI as it should have been.
Right. Jason, thank you very, very much.
So that was my conversation with Jason Matheny from the White House. It was a very interesting perspective on how the Biden administration views its priority as they relate to artificial intelligence.